is a review of the Cold War. By definition, the Cold War was a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted for nearly 50 years, from the end of World War II through the collapse of the Soviet Union, symbolically marked by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, but then officially in the early 90s, the Soviet Union as a communist bloc will break up. This covers a long period of presidential administrations as well, and policy in the post-World War II era. The main competition is between the United States values and ideas in the West about democracy, individual freedom, and a free market economy, in competition with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc nations, which were more totalitarian in nature, and communist, more state-centered than we are in our free democratic system. Of course, the stakes are high in this undeclared Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union because of the nuclear war threat. Upon the end of World War II, the nuclear bomb was, of course, used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II in the Pacific Theater against Japan. And as the Soviet Union enters into the competition with the United States following World War II, they also will gain atomic energy. So it's an arms race that makes the stakes very high during the Cold War. One of the organizations, of course, that was founded near the end of World War II was the United Nations. The United Nations replaced the failed League of Nations from World War I era to provide a place for international dialogue and prevent future conflict. The only problem was, during the Cold War era, you can see the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council represented both free nations, including the United States, and communist nations, including the Soviet Union and then later China. So even though the United Nations is a place for international dialogue to prevent future conflict, it too becomes a non-traditional front in the debates between communism and democracy. As far as Europe goes, this is a real important map for you to notice. At the end of World War II, the Eastern Bloc nations are controlled by the Soviet Union. The Western Bloc nations, for the most part of Europe, remained free and non-communist, based on democratic values. And of course, this map lines up with the way World War II had ended. The Soviet Union had liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, and the United States and the other allies from World War II had liberated the western part. This was, of course, we talked about D-Day on this side of Europe. During the Cold War, there were defensive pacts, defensive alliances that were formed. In the Western Bloc free nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established. This included also the United States. So if there was any act of aggression on the part of the communists to the free bloc European Western nations, NATO would come in to defend that freedom. As a balance to this, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, founded the Warsaw Pact of Warsaw, Poland, and this represented the defensive alliance of the communist Eastern Bloc nations. So that intensified the tensions to have these defensive alliances networked during the Cold War. President Harry Truman was, of course, President of the United States through most of the early period of the Cold War, from the end of World War II to 1953. The Truman Doctrine comes to be known as containment. And even though it starts during the Truman years, containment becomes the primary foreign policy throughout the entire Cold War. And the idea behind containment is that we would not roll back communism, but instead keep it from spreading and resist communist aggression in other parts of the world. We read George Kennan's report to Washington. George Kennan was a scholar and a diplomat on Russia, and his basic idea for containment was that Stalin and the Soviet Union was aggressive because they were insecure. So it would not be wise to attack them directly, but it would be wise to stay strong and contain those nations with the hope that communism and the Soviet bloc would mellow its aggressive tendencies over time and freedom would have a chance to win. So containment, keeping communism from spreading, becomes the main premise behind this. Part of containment was a lot of money being spent after World War II under the premises of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan provided massive financial aid to rebuild European economies and prevent the spread of communism. The fear was if we left Europe not rebuilt at the end of World War II, that those economies and those countries would remain weak and be open for the spread of communism. So it was also a sort of method of containment through this massive financial aid. Of course, you notice most of the money is going to go to the Western Bloc nations, the free nations, because Stalin, as you see in this cartoon, will block any funding coming into his Eastern Bloc nations. He does not want United States money. He does not want interference in his bloc nations. So the western part of Europe rebuilds, prospers, and the eastern part of Europe remains economically deprived following World War II. Turning to Asia, Japan, which had been our enemy in the Pacific theater of World War II and destroyed with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, following World War II during the Cold War, was occupied by the United States. This is, of course, General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the occupation period. Soon, Japan will adopt a democratic constitution, a democratic form of government. It's called the MacArthur Constitution. They will resume self-government and become a strong ally in the Cold War for the United States in that theater of the world. In contrast, China, which had been an ally of ours during World War II, in contrast, during the Cold War, was experiencing a civil war, Mao Zedong versus Chiang Kai-shek. The United States would spend lots and lots of money to support Chiang Kai-shek's efforts to be leader of China because Mao Zedong was the communist contender. And despite all of the American aid in the name of containment to try to stop the spread of communism to China, Chiang Kai-shek is not successful. He and his followers will flee to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong, the communist leader, will take over China in 1949. So containment does not work. We lose China in 1949, and it just so happens that's the same year that the Soviets also developed an atom bomb. So the fear of communist domination of the world by the late 1940s is very prevalent. Ultimately, China and the Soviet Union will become rivals for power in the communist world, and later we'll learn about President Nixon, who will travel to China and meet with Mao Zedong. Will try to pick up on this rivalry to try to ease the tensions of the Cold War by playing each of these rivals against each other. As far as Korea, here's Korea. Korea is divided at the end of World War II at the 38th parallel, partitioned, much like we saw Germany. Germany was partitioned east and west. East, of course, communist, and west was democratic. In Asia, the partition is north and south at the 38th parallel. North Korea is communist, South Korea is democratic. And in 1950, the conflict is triggered when North Korea crosses the 38th parallel into the democratic Free Korea. And of course, this triggers the policy of containment into action because, of course, the fear is if we're not tough, that communist aggression will spread throughout Asia. It's often referred to as the domino effect. So the United States, under a UN-led mission led by General Douglas MacArthur, this is not technically a declaration of war, this is a peacekeeping action by the United Nations in the name of containment, will lead a counterattack that will drive deep into North Korea itself. And of course, when that happens, and we drive too deep into North Korea, that pulls the communist Chinese in. And of course, they come to support their border and support the communist North Koreans. So the war in Korea threatens to widen, threatens to involve more troops than we had anticipated with just the North Koreans. It includes the Chinese. We have fear that the Soviet Union might enter, and of course with them having the atom bomb, that's quite scary and something we didn't want to happen. So eventually by 1953 there is a ceasefire. There's an armistice line that is drawn, and essentially it ends basically where it had started at the 38th parallel. So it ends in stalemate. North Korea, even to this day, is communist, and of course South Korea is of course still democratic, and this is the side of Korea that we support. North Korea has been in the news, we've learned a lot recently, still very antagonistic towards the democratic West and particularly the United States. As far as the home front is concerned, the Cold War is largely associated with being tough on communism and making sure that we don't have any disloyal people that are not supporting American democratic values. This is particularly important in the late 1940s because, of course, we just lost China. The Soviets now have the atom bomb. So the question is, how can we be losing? And the answer for a lot of Americans was that there must be disloyalty at home. So there was a great Red Scare, a communist scare. Are there spies amongst us? Alger Hiss is one of the State Department employees who is accused of being a spy. Here, famously, is Alger Hiss under testimony from the House on Un-American Activities Committee. This is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the lead Republican on the House on Un-American Activities Committee. So this is before he was President of the United States, and he was making a name for himself for being tough on communism. The other member of Congress, Senator Joseph McCarthy, was another name that becomes synonymous with hunting communist. McCarthy argued that he had no names in the State Department, in the government. Ultimately, he'll accuse the military of having known communists in their offices. So he'll lead a witch hunt for spies, and oftentimes his evidence was very flimsy. It was false accusations, it was guilt by association, and so his name becomes associated with a whole era called McCarthyism, where there was sort of a reckless regard for truth and evidence in the name of hunting communists. And ultimately he will be his own downfall, as many of these interrogations are on television, and he implodes basically with lack of evidence before the American public, especially when he starts accusing the U.S. military of having communist ties. Unfortunately, one of the more famous names that becomes synonymous with spies during the McCarthy era is a married couple, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. They were convicted and executed as spies. They were accused of leaking secrets of our nuclear weapons to the Soviets. And much like a lot of it during the McCarthy era, it was based on very weak evidence. But they were executed by electrocution, so they become one of the more famous names to be associated with spying. Of course, to prepare for the event of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, the U.S. government tried to promote civilian preparedness to what degree they could. One of these campaigns was the Duck and Cover campaign. We watched this film in class, Bert the Turtle, encouraging students in school, if they see the flash, if we know that a bomb is coming, to duck under their desk and to cover their heads. And of course we said this was not realistic as true preparedness for survival, because we looked at pictures of what had happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ducking under your school desk is not necessarily going to save your life if you're at ground zero, but it was a measure to feeling like you're doing something to prepare for the event of war with the Soviet Union. The other thing, just to encourage preparedness, citizens were encouraged to build fallout shelters. Here's the fallout nuclear symbol, telling people where to go, where there was a near bomb shelter. Encourage people to build these bomb shelters in their backyard, have a deep basement perhaps, where you could stockpile food for a couple of weeks to survive the bomb and then also survive the nuclear fallout that came after. Of course, you needed to have a Geiger counter, which would check for radioactivity levels afterwards. And again, this was just a measure of preparedness for the just-in-case atomic war with the Soviet Union. And then finally, just bringing it home to Virginia. Virginia increased its defense spending more than any other state in the Union, partly because of its connections to the shipping industry, the shipping yards in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and partly because of its association with government contracts coming from Northern Virginia and the Pentagon. Pentagon is up in Northern Virginia, just across from the nation's capital. So a lot going on during the Truman years. Please review these slides in your notes, and the next video will review Eisenhower, and we'll talk a little bit about JFK into the 60s.